Hey, this is Brimstone. You're watching AFK away from the keyboard. Ain't no better place to be than right here watching now.
CW35. I'm also on Fox San Antonio, News 4 San Antonio, hence the breaking news. But we actually kind of do have some, how about updated news? We're going to get straight to it. So I definitely understand the time that we can't get a panel started if we don't have our full panel. But luckily for us, we have one guest with us. We are going to introduce, this is writer Denny O'Neil. He's been associated with Batman since 1968, and he's here to be a part of our 75 years of Batman. Mr. Denny, would you come on out, sir? Can we give him a round of applause? Anywhere. Pick a seat, any seat. Now, he has worked closely with Neil Adams, who is an artist. In fact, they've known each other for 50 years, is what he told me. And he says, well, I saw Neil hanging around here somewhere. We just can't find these folks right now. Troy Baker, I know, is definitely going to be here later. And Julie Newman, well, you know what? If y'all have seen Julie, tell her to come on down, because we're not quite sure where she is right now. But all that matters is Denny's here. And we are going to ask you, hey, first off, how are you enjoying San Antonio?
I don't know what you said, because
I will get closer.
we're off to a great start, folks.
Can I sit with you?
Sure.
How are you enjoying
Take two.
San Antonio? How do you like town, the Alamo City?
How do I have never been anywhere near San Antonio before, though we've spent a lot of time in Texas. And we haven't really had a chance to see much. We got here late last night, and
Well, welcome.
but we're looking forward to, people tell me that it's a scenic town, and I just learned recently that there are a lot of comic book scholars in San Antonio.
I didn't know that.
It seems to me I spend about a third of my time dealing with academics, people who study this stuff. And that's weird, because I still think of myself as a disreputable hippie doing evil work. Because when I started, they thought comic book guys were about a half step above pornographers in the common estimate. The early guys, including Stan Lee, who is next here, now we're...
Stand by.
Are we still? Yeah.
Apple de la Fuente, everyone.
Oh, we're joined by... should I?
Keep going.
Mike Uslan, who has got a producer credit on the last 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, well, all the Batman movies since 1988, made a documentary about the old comic book guys, and I certainly qualify, though it was refreshing for me not to be the oldest guy in the room for once. But he interviewed people like Stan, and the first generation guys, you can consider me second generation, and they all kind of said the same thing. Even Stan, who was not shy about promoting Marvel Comics, said that, you know, he'd say, well, I work in New York publishing, you know, or I work in magazines. If he was at a cocktail party, and if he was finally backed into a corner and forced to utter the words comic book, he said that ended the conversation. Whoever was talking to him fled. My first mother-in-law wouldn't tell people what I did for a living. That was coming, there had been a big witch hunt in the 50s. And a lot of people believed none of you were alive in the 50s, but, you know, conformity was a virtue. And a lot of people were, I don't know if they were sincere or they were trying to advance their careers, but they attacked comic books the way that Senator Joe McCarthy in the House of Representatives was attacking other media and the State Department. I have in my hand a list of 88 known communists, which he didn't. Well, there were people who went after comic books like that. There was a senator who had presidential ambitions named Estes Kefauver, who convened in New York City, where they'd get a lot of press, a panel to investigate this comic book menace. And there was a book called Seduction of the Innocent. Now think about that title and that time, and you would envision a paperback book with a very scantily clad lady on the cover seducing somebody. This guy was a New York City psychiatrist in the era when, as I said, authority figures were not questioned, and it was considered a virtue to obey them. And if you read the book as published and you think about it, it's got a lot of dubious claims, one of which is, in effect, control groups don't count. So the good doctor would say, you know, I can show you 100 juvenile delinquents who read these comic books, and ignored the fact that I can show you 1 million altar boys who have also read these comic books. And then, as bad as that was, about 3 years ago, a wonderful, bright young woman from Illinois named Carol Tilley actually went into Wortham's files and discovered that he had cooked the books. He had tampered with his research. His research was dubious to begin with and is now completely invalidated. So I was past that when I started. And comic books were in the middle of a resurgence. I got my start because I was a reporter in a small Missouri paper. And I had noticed that I was seeing comic books again, and then realized, geez, these things were important to me when I was 6. And I haven't seen them for 10 years. I was right, because after Frederick Wortham and the other witch hunters, comics imploded. There's a very good book by David Hagew that tells us that 800 people lost their jobs virtually overnight. Most of them never recovered. But we were inching past that. An editor, I was lucky enough to work for the 2 greatest editors in the field. Julia Schwartz reinvented the entire DC pantheon. Starting with, as he says, he was sitting at an editorial meeting and somebody decided to revive The Flash. These superheroes had not been in publication for a decade. He said, well, I'm stuck. Well, most people would have just taken Jay Garrick, the 1940s Flash, and written a story about it. Julie rethought the character and made it very contemporary. And when that was a surprise success, he did it with the rest of the DC superheroes. And then about a year later, Stan Lee came up with a new way of writing this stuff. And more than that, a new attitude. He got back to remembering the comics should be fun and interesting. And he ignored the so-called educators. I teach at a major university, and my wife taught school for 50 years. So we ain't, and my son teaches. We're not against education. But there were people who said, if you don't have the heroes express themselves in 10-word declarative sentences of impeccable grammar, you will corrupt their intellects or something. So slang was out the door, dialect was out the door. Stan ignored all that. And he kind of did this stuff tongue-in-cheek. Okay, I was an ex-Navy guy, and I had a college degree, and I had a girlfriend, wow. And I considered myself pretty doggone sophisticated. So because Stan wasn't taking it seriously, I didn't take it seriously, and that left me free to enjoy the stuff I think I was really enjoying. I liked the fantasy adventure. So that was the world into which I came. We were disreputable, just beginning to find reputability. And while my back was turned, I became respectable. And now I teach at a major university. Almost all my contemporaries have some kind of teaching job. And the New York Times, which once would not publish the words comic book, it's my main source of information. And also that last Batman movie made over $1 billion. Anything that makes that kind of money is respectable. So that is why I am here, and we are joined by...
Yeah.
Apple de la Fuente. You guys, everybody knows Apple, head of the Comic Con.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. So let's go ahead and tell how Denny O'Neil is actually tied to San Antonio. Because there was this little boy that grew up on the east side of San Antonio and found his cousin's stack of comic books. There was an issue called Batman 250. It was drawn by Neil Adams and written by Mr. Denny O'Neil. So in a rough neighborhood where gangs were announced, the east side of San Antonio, growing up in Wheatley Courts and Sutton Homes, this was the little boy's environment. He didn't want to join gangs, but there was always peer pressure. And we know how peer pressure is. So he would escape to these comics, never telling anybody about the comics that he had or the collection that he had. He kept it hidden. So the stories that Denny O'Neil wrote were his escape from a bad neighborhood. That kid then went on to handle media for San Diego Comic Con, helped out with DC Comics. I was very, very much excited when I got to meet Denny O'Neil. That little boy was me. And I got to interview Denny O'Neil for the first time it was DC's 75th story. We were in San Diego. We were in one of the top rooms at the top, and we're talking about the video that they got to do. And I had told Mr. O'Neil that, thank you for saving my life. And he just laughed, and it was something that I knew later on I would go ahead and explain. And Mr. O'Neil, this is that moment when I get to explain and you get to see what that little boy, when you wrote comic books, was able to do.
I just realized we're on camera. I'd have worn my good suit,
Apple, thank you for sharing that story. I feel like I shouldn't be up here with you guys, and for sharing it with everybody else too. Well, I know that we are not going to have too much time during this panel, but I know you guys have been waiting so patiently. Do we happen to have any questions from any of you guys? If you want to raise your hand or head up to one of the mics, go ahead.
What was it like translating from writing Nightfall for a comic book to the novel that you wrote?
Oh, what a good question. Yeah. I take about an hour to explain that when I'm teaching it. Very briefly, that whole thing was a huge educational experience for me. We were in the middle of this unexpectedly successful storyline that was going to take, I think it ended up being 1,100 pages. And then it was picked up by the BBC for a radio show, and then somebody decided to do a hardcover novel. And they asked me if I'd do it. But the minimum, I said, well, I can maybe do 70,000 words. No, it has to be 100,000 words. So I was editing the comic books, I was writing some of the comic books, and I thought this was too much. And then that cute little farmer school teacher who's sitting over there said, Denny, you'll hate yourself if you let somebody else do it. So the main thing I found out is that in comics, you express emotion and conflict through action. It's a visual medium. So you don't want many fights. After I wrote, in comic books, that's the way you express conflict, by people doing, especially superhero comics. In a novel, I only know, I read a whole lot of books, and I only know of 2 writers who can bring off action in comic books. One of them just died, the guy who writes the Spencer novel. James Lee Burke is the other. And they only have about 2 action scenes per book. And I realized, analyze what is this scene about? And then I realized it's expressing conflict, and I can do that in a dialogue scene. That is working to the novel form strengths. And then I realized maybe for the first time that each medium is radically different. That came in later when I started dealing with the movies. And that our job is, as something Stanley Kaufman said in a movie review 50 years ago, our job is not to take what's in the comic book and put it in the novel or in the movie. Our job is to think about the story and recreate it as though you're translating a poem. If you translate a poem verbatim, you'll get gibberish. What you do is recreate the poem in your own idiom. So when we're doing work like this, that's what we do. And then from there on, you invent, you nip, you cut. In the particular story you're talking about, I cut a lot and invented here and there. And wrote it under a ferocious deadline in the middle of these, like 40 days or whatever it was that I had. Mary Frances Ann and I were going home to our home state for Christmas, and guess what I did? I hit a wall going 70 miles an hour. And the car did a lot of somersaults, and we ended up in the hospital. And we survived, the car didn't. I looked at that ball of metal later, how did we survive that? But that really put us on, I lost 2 weeks' work, and that put us under the gun. The editor, Charlie Kochman, and I were working on the book the day it had to go to press, but we made it. And I now feel that was a really interesting mountain to climb. It was a challenge, and I never want to have to do that again. So
Well, I'm glad you didn't let anybody else. It's the best book. I'm serious. It's so good.
Oh, thank you.
I think we might have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Anybody want to come up to the mic?
You know what, Mr. I want you to tell them, because Mr. O'Neil he was able to bring back, really, everyone thinks that Batman's my favorite character. Well, he's kind of number 2. My first is the Joker. And this man right here brought back and took away, I guess, how would you describe that? The campiness of the Joker? And you brought back that more serious, psychotic, maybe?
Yeah, the evil clown, it's a really interesting, resonant image. And that's what Bill Finger wrote in 1940. And then it kind of lost its way. But yeah, Neil and I started doing this work because there was an enormously popular television show on ABC. Is Adam West a guest here? He's often
Julie
a guest.
Newmar.
Well, she's supposed to be here, and maybe she became the invisible girl, and she's sitting over there. Right? But when it was a comedic version of Batman, and perfectly fine on its own terms. But it was a one-line joke, and when it was over, it was over. I mean, bang, hugely successful first season, okay, second season, third season, the end. And I was a freelance writer. I walked into Julie's office, and he had offered me Batman a year earlier. And I thought, well, I can't do, and that's not my sensibility. But camp is exaggerating certain aspects of something that is serious, and something in this particular iteration of camp that you loved when you were a kid, and now look how stupid it seems to me that I'm grown up with a cocaine habit and a shrink and Brooks Brothers clothes. So as I said, it's a one-line joke, and when it was gone, it was gone. The comics had been half-heartedly trying to follow the lead of the television show, and I walked in one day and Julie said, "We're going to change Batman, and do you have anything?" And I thought that let's go back to what Bill Finger, and on television the other day I kept referring to this guy as the artist because I didn't want to use his name, but Bob Kane had started with in May of 1939, the lone obsessed avenger, the man of the night. And that's what we did. And for years, from lecture platforms and such, I told people, we just went back to the original. Then I was given the job of editing Batman in the mid-'80s, and I read a lot of the old stuff. No, what we did, that version, which is still the go-to version, the default mode, could not have been done without Bill Finger's fifth Batman story. Everything we did was implicit in there. But it was gone from the continuity within a year when Batman got Robin and became a surrogate father, and occasionally referred to, but it no longer was at the center of the stories. So I can't speak for Neil, who is also turned invisible. But I thought, well, I had a false image, a false memory. I was remembering stuff that I'd assembled maybe from 100 different stories in pieces, and thought that, yeah, that was the first Batman story. No, not at all. But but that's what Neil and I did. Secret of the Waiting Graves. And then we were off and running. And I have to keep emphasizing when I tell this story, I am totally beholden to Bill Finger. But Batman, like a lot of the superheroes, kind of lost its center because there were a dozen different guys writing it. And in those days, continuity was character consistency. Nobody cared about it. So, if you're one guy, you write Batman the way you like it, and if you're another guy, you do something else, and the costume remains the same. So it was a combination of Neil and myself, who'd been in the business 5 years, having our toolkit together. But by that time, we knew how to do comic books. This wonderful opportunity, Julie Schwartz saying, whatever you want to do. And here we are in San Antonio, 50 years later.
Way to go, Denny. Well, we can't thank you enough for being here. Don't know where our invisible friends are, but that's fine. It was a pleasure having you, sharing your story, Apple. Thank you for that. You guys can go and bond some more behind the stage. But in the meantime, it looks like we do have another panel. From what I read correctly, it's going to be Stan Lee. So I guess if you guys want to stay here and see him, and I think we're going to let some more folks come in. But thanks for coming here, guys. It's 75 years of Batman.